Well, folks, we're back for another Festival of Legends card review, and this time around we have our first batch of neutral cards. We've got a couple legendaries here, including Tony, King of Piracy, here behind me, which this looks like a spicy card. We got a lot to talk about with this one, but before we do, let's talk about our sponsor for this video, Opera GX. Yeah, if you haven't heard of Opera GX, it's a browser built specifically for gamers, and there's a version for your phone as well. One of the best parts of the Opera GX browser is GX Control, which lets you monitor and adjust the amount of resources your browser is using. You can actually use sliders here to allocate how much RAM or CPU or network usage you're going to allocate to Opera GX to help keep all of that stuff in check. You're probably used to browsers eating up a ton of RAM and CPU, which of course can be a problem if you're trying to game as well. You can actually see the difference right here between Opera GX and Chrome. I have the exact same 2 tabs open in both browsers, but Opera GX has a much lower memory commitment. Another thing I love about Opera GX is GX Corner. This is a space that allows you to track all kinds of upcoming game releases. So if I want to find something to stream, this is a great place to see what's coming out soon. But it also helps you find different free-to-play games and then free games from various services. So if you're looking for something cheap to grab, this could be a great place to find some options. So if you want to find a bunch of free games, or maybe spend hours and hours watching your favorite YouTuber on the Opera GX browser, then you can hit that link down there in the description to get it now. It's totally free, so check it out. All right, so Tony, King of Piracy, here is a 5-mana 4/6 pirate, and he reads both players' decks are swapped and finale draw a card. Now, there's something really, really important to note here. That is not a battle cry. That is an aura effect on Tony. So basically, if your opponent kills the Tony, removes the Tony, whatever it is, the decks are going to immediately swap back. It's a aura swapping, not an action of a swapping. So he has to be existing on board for this effect to work. And I'm told too, if there's like multiple Tonys or whatever, they can only swap once. They're either swapped or not. They don't like swap back and forth crazy multiple times. So the idea here is, with the finale, if you finish your turn on Tony, you get to draw a card from your opponent's deck right away. And of course, if you're like on fatigue or something and you swap decks, your opponent's going to go to their turn and they're going to take some fatigue damage from an empty deck and not get a card, and maybe won't have an answer for Tony in hand, of course. So some interesting ideas there. Also noteworthy is if you want to play this pre-finale, of course, you can have, maybe 5 mana remaining or something, playing Tony first, and then like have 5 mana to draw through your opponent's deck. So if you had a bunch of like cheap card draw cards acquired already, something that's like discounted or 0 mana or something for whatever reason, you might be able to draw a bunch of cards from your opponent's deck prior to playing Tony, which I think will often feel a little bit better than using him for that finale just to draw 1, unless, you just want to play him on turn 5. That's pretty interesting, right? There are some real shenanigans possible with a card like this one. I like cards like this a lot, and I actually think there will be some combos and some setups. A deck that's just running a ton of card draw, playing to fatigue, drawing as much as possible, playing the Tony, ripping through the opponent's deck, destroying stuff, whatever it might be. You can imagine a lot of different ways to completely wreck your opponent's deck. And if they don't have a big hand to work with in particular, or a way to answer Tony, and if you have some other way to protect Tony or get multiple Tonys or whatever it is, right, there's possibilities that exist here. I don't think that'll end up being like a tier 1 deck. I don't think Blizzard would want that to be something like a tier 1 deck, but will it be viable? Will it be tier 2? Is there some Tony deck, some combo that's going to exist out there? I actually think that's completely possible, and I'm sure lots of folks are already cooking up various ways to utilize Tony in one way or another, and I'm sure we'll get even more in the future as well, since we're here early in rotation. This is going to be a limited card pool, but 8 months from now or whatever, we're going to have a lot more cards to work with when it comes to Tony. So the next fresh reveal here is the Merch Seller, a new 4-mana 3/5 Naga. At the end of your turn, put a random spell on the top of your opponent's deck. So a little bit of extra disruption here again, giving your opponent some kind of garbage card instead of a good one. So the question for this really is, are you willing to play just a 4-mana 3/5 for a little bit of, hand disruption to your opponent. Keep in mind, it's not like removing any of their cards. They're not losing any cards. They're just kind of losing this one draw for now. Or I guess if they can't kill the merch seller, they could just keep getting random spell after random spell. To me, that sounds a little bit too low impact for its sort of shenanigan levels. You know, Tony does something so crazy and big and universal, even though it might be a shenanigan, it could be a game-winning sort of shenanigan. This just feels like a little speed bump. I don't think this is really going to disrupt people all that much, and sometimes the random spell might be even useful, and you're of course just playing a merch seller that you're not really excited to play. This is just a 3/5, so you're sacrificing a lot to make the opponent only sacrifice a little. That doesn't feel like a good exchange to me. And then next up here we have the Outfit Tailor, a new 3-mana 2/2 with a battle cry. Give a friendly minion attack and health equal to this minion's. So at a base, this is a 2/2 that gives a 2/2 buff on board. I actually don't think that's terrible at a base. There are some decks that care about early minions and stats on board, some divine shields or something. That's kind of nifty already. Like, is Paladin gonna like that at a base level? But then when you start to mix hand buffs into the conversation, the Outfit Tailor sounds really interesting. If this is like a 4/4 that gives a 4/4 buff on board, that could really help. Sometimes the problem with hand buff and hand buff synergy cards is converting those stats into more immediate relevance on board. And this does that. This becomes, you know, a blessing of kings attached to the body itself. So being able to duplicate and emphasize those stats a little bit more quickly, or maybe putting them on a rush minion, a taunt minion, whatever it is, that starts to sound a little more intriguing to me. I think this could be a little bit of a sleeper for a neutral card. We're going to talk about a lot of cards in this video I don't think are going to be great, just kind of like neutral filler type stuff. I would say keep an eye out on the Outfit Tailor. Posic Audio Engineer, a new 4-mana 5/4 with battle cry. Add 2 3/3 bots to your opponent's hand, and then Death Rattle, summon them for yourself. So the way this is going to work, you're going to add those bots to hand, much like Mukula might have added some bananas to the opponent's hand. That does mean you can fill their hands and potentially force them to burn a card they would otherwise draw off the top. And then if those cards remain in hand and Posic is killed, then he will summon the 2 3/3 bots from their hand, reopening that hand space, but getting you 2 3/3 minions. Now, alternatively, the opponent can actually play out the bots, and if they do choose to play the bots prior to killing off Posic, he's not going to summon anything. So, you know, for instance, if you played this late in the game and your opponent had, you know, the willingness or ability to spend 6 mana on a couple bots, they could just play those out, kill Posic, and then he's not going to have a Death Rattle effectively. But of course, on turn 4, that might be a much higher friction play for them. They don't maybe want to spend 3 mana on an audio bot, or if they did, maybe they can't quite kill the Posic right away. So this could definitely create some high friction moments where the opponent has to either make a bad play by playing an audio bot or multiple audio bots, or they have to just kill the Posic and accept the fact that you're going to get a couple 3/3s. Now, I'll be honest, if you put this card into the meta today, I'm not actually convinced this would get played very much. It's a really low synergy sort of card, kind of has some mech play, but otherwise a lot of decks have really refined game plans and synergies they're playing towards, and Posic probably wouldn't fit very well into that game plan. It's just a big pile of stats, which just doesn't really work in really refined metas all that often. Now, that said, though, we're moving into a fresh rotation meta where there are less expansions, there are less synergistic game plans, and these kinds of cards tend to work a little bit better in those metas where decks are just looking for those last 4 or 5 cards to fill out a deck list. And if you've got some kind of aggressive game plan, this might just be one of the most effective ways to get some aggression and stats on board in the mid game. So we may see a few decks running Posic just because of that. I don't really expect any kind of mill game plan to really care all that much about Posic. That's always a possibility, but that's really a fringe archetype, typically at best, in Hearthstone, so I wouldn't expect that to be an angle for this card, but I could see a very short lifespan on this one in the next expansion, maybe even stretching into the one beyond that, where this is just a big pile of bodies and that's enough. But I still worry the risk of the opponent just playing these out and being fine with that and giving your opponent potential resources. It does have some downsides, and I think it falls off dramatically post turn 4 in its effectiveness. So this is kind of a super piloted shredder almost, in an era where piloted shredder style cards don't get as much play. So small potential briefly, and then I think kind of goes away forever. So next up here is the audio amplifier. This is a 2-mana 2/3. It's a mech with Battlecry. Set your maximum mana and hand size to 11. So you can actually turn it up to 11, which is great. And of course, this answers that question about the Druid Beetle card that had Mana Thirst 11. We were all wondering what was going to happen once Guff rotated. Well, you can still run the audio amplifier here, as can every other class, since this is a neutral. So if you're a deck that's looking to keep a lot of cards in hands or just have a lot of extra mana to work with in the late game, squeezing in an audio amplifier early might just be worth it. I actually don't know that, like a control deck that's just looking for a bunch of cards and a bunch of mana is going to be willing to sacrifice a card slot for the audio amplifier, just kind of playing out a 2-mana 2/3 and not reaping the benefits for a while. Feels like that could be a limiter for a control deck, but there could be specific combo decks that really need exactly 11 mana in order to make a game-winning sort of play that do care about the audio amplifier. So if that's a breakpoint that's relevant or shows up for a deck where they just can't get the combo done with 11, but they can can't get it done with 10, but they can with 11, then of course an audio amplifier makes sense. You've kind of got this question: do you run 2 of these for redundancy, just to make sure you find it on time, or do you only run 1 of these because the second one doesn't do anything? It doesn't increase it again by 1 or anything. It sets it right to 11. So some interesting questions there, but so in other words, a card that shows up, I think, very rarely for decks that need it exactly, but I don't think most decks are actually going to care much about this one. I think going toe-to-toe with 10v10 is what we're going to see for most matchups. So next up here is the Frequency Oscillator. This is a new 1-mana 2/1 mech with Battlecry. The next mech you play costs 1 less. So this looks like a really nice little tempo minion for some mech synergy stuff. And like we said, sometimes these more minion-based early game strategies can work really nicely right after a rotation. They just kind of have a plan that works. There aren't a lot of synergies to compete against, so just a big pile of mechs in a deck could be good. And, playing 2 Frequency Oscillators on turn 1, cheating out a 3-drop on turn 2, that could be the kind of early swarm that just steals games and runs away with games. This also allows you to sometimes cheat out bigger mechs a turn sooner. Just, play your 5-drop mech on turn 4, whatever it is. Can be meaningful as well. So yeah, this looks like a nice little mech enabler as far as I'm concerned. The Amplified Elec here is a big old boy, 10-mana 6/12 beast with Taunt and Death Rattle, deal 3 damage to all enemy minions. So as a straight up minion, of course, just a big 10-mana card like this is not going to see play. There are some potentials here. We're cheating this into play in some way, recruit effects, cheat from hand effects. We've seen cards like this kind of work. This is nice that it has kind of a 2-part safety net here. Like, it's a big body, but also if that big body gets removed easily, it's also got this Death Rattle that could be nice. Could also explore some Death Rattle synergies for this one as well. I still think it's probably too expensive, and most decks will have cheaper alternatives, but cards like this from time to time have found that occasional niche home just because they are so gigantic. And then next up here is the Stereo Totem, a 2-mana 0/3 totem. At the end of your turn, give a random in your hand +2/+2. Hey, we looked at a hand buff card already. That could be interesting. But I like that this is a totem that gives stats potentially to your other totems. We've still got some totem stuff lingering around in Shaman as well. So this could be a nice new card for that deck. But also keep in mind, we've seen some amalgam stuff, some menagerie styles of play. The 1 amalgam band. This could be a totem that you use in your amalgam decks. If you don't want to have to rely on your amalgam, you want just one of every minion type organically, Stereo Totem is a good option perhaps for your neutral totem, especially, there could be like a warrior menagerie deck that cares about hand buffs, that cares about totems. Same thing for Paladin, right? We've already seen the Purator. I guess that's a pure card though, so this is probably not a good fit there, but there's still a possibility for this kind of hand buff menagerie crossover or something, and Stereo Totem could exist even outside of a totem deck because of that possibility. Next up is the Worgen Roadie, a new 3-mana 3/4. Battlecry, summon a 0/3 instrument case for your opponent, and then if you kill that instrument case, you get a random weapon out of it. And boy, that is pretty expensive. You gotta play a vanilla statted Roadie here. You gotta spend some attacks or something, removal on the instrument case. Got to trade into it to kill it off, and then you still have to spend mana on a random weapon. And of course, random weapons really run the gamut as far as like whether they're good or bad, but a lot of them have really specific synergies or things you can't always utilize very well. So I would say really mediocre setup. extra commitment to get it done, and the reward absolutely sucks. So in other words, the Worgen Roadie feels completely unplayable as far as I'm concerned in standard. There's like one tiny hint of hope maybe if you really needed to like disrupt your opponent's resurrection pool by putting an instrument case in their resurrect pool. Like maybe, but I think that's still really unlikely and really bad. So this card just looks incredibly weak to me. So next up here we have the Metronome, which is an incredibly clever name, and he's a 3-mana 2/4 mech, and he reads after you play a 1-cost card, draw a 2-cost card, then increase. So then it would be after you play a 2-cost card, draw a 3-cost card. So he basically creates this little chain of draws here potentially where you can just move from 1 to 2 to 3 and so on. That said, if you want to draw a lot off of this guy, you're going to need a lot of mana because that starts to ramp up. You know, you spend 4 mana total for the first draw, and then you're already looking at 6 mana total to get to that second one, and then 9 mana total, and then you're kind of capped out, of course, outside of some mana cheat. So, you know, for a 1-turn draw engine of sorts, he starts to limit himself pretty quickly, and also you're forced to play exactly the cards you get, which may not always be perfect for the scenario. You may not really want to play the 2-cost card, and you have to have that 1-cost card in hand too to kick off the Metronome, which sometimes that might be hard to have in hand. It's like, oh, I never found the 1-cost, I need to get this going, or I already played the 1-cost because I'm playing like a mech deck and I wanted to get some tempo down early. So I do think there's some real limitations here in both the setup for the Metronome and kind of, you know, executing his draw. I think there's limitations and perhaps problems there where it's not really what you want to play at the right times. If it's just minions, maybe you can just plop stuff down, but still feels a little bit iffy and a little bit too specific. I could maybe see some kind of combo deck for this where you like have exactly 1-cost, 2-cost, 3-cost spells that you know, do something cool together, or they're just all damage or something, but even that still feels a little weird. You know, this is a pretty natural comparison to the card Spirit of the Frog of old, but what was great about this one is you could kick it off with any cost spell. So, you know, it didn't have to be a 1-cost thing. Anything would just start the chain going because it just naturally did one more. But beyond that, this had stealth. So you could set it up a turn early and then have full mana utilization to get that chain going on future turns. The Metronome doesn't have stealth. You can't set it up early. So you're kind of paying this 3-mana overhead at the top of it. And that means you don't have as much mana left to work with. So just feels like kind of a more awkward version in a lot of ways. Yeah, it's got this 2/4 body as a base. That's okay. Maybe some mech decks can squeeze this in, but doesn't feel quite as exciting to me as similar sorts of cards. Next up here we have the Pyrotechnician, a 4-mana 2/5 that reads after you cast a spell, add a random fire spell to your hand. And boy, this just looks really bad to me. 4 mana to kick this effect off is crazy high, I think. A 2/5 body is not exciting at all. And then you get random fire spells as your payoff, which they just aren't going to be good enough on average. They're just going to be random stuff. Like, yeah, sometimes you'll get damage and that's cool, but you're going to get a lot of other random things as well that just aren't particularly good for you. So yeah, sure, it's you know, an infinite value generator, but it's really kind of an infinite garbage generator, and I think it's just way too expensive to get it rolling. Moving on here to the Static Waveform. This is a 3-mana 5/6 elemental, and it reads at the start of each turn, lose 1 attack or health chosen randomly. So for onboard effects that are each turn, and especially since this is capitalized for emphasis, much like Gruul, we think this will happen on both your turn and the opponent's turn. For in-hand effects that read each turn, typically that's only on your turn. So what that means is by the time you're able to attack with this, you play it down, you lose a turn, your opponent has a turn, it's going to be basically a 4/5 average when it comes back to you. So a 3-mana 4/5 that you know, that's okay. That's a Yeti stat line for 3. Ultimately it's you know, it's still just a stat line. It doesn't have any other effects, and it's gonna keep getting smaller and smaller. Plus it's not always a 4/5, right? Sometimes it like loses a bunch of health and it dies really easily, and it can't like survive a value trade or anything, and sometimes it probably kills itself because it's down to 1 health and it loses health chosen randomly. It may not be able to. Maybe it can only take something if there's extra available, but I think it will probably end up killing itself sometimes. So in other words, just a pile of stats here that falls off really fast in game and scales itself down so quickly that even in its best case scenarios, I don't really think the Static Waveform is going to be worth it. You probably just want some stats that are more reliable or have some other upside. We have a lot of 3-mana cards that are like, you know, 4/3 3s now with death rattles that are getting you stuff and having really useful effects that a couple extra stat points here just aren't worth it for all the downsides on this card. Finally, here we have the Festival Security, and I gotta say, I'm not as high on this card as a lot of people I've seen so far. I think the stats on this one are just a little bit too low. He's a 3-mana 2/5 taunt. Finale, force all enemy minions to attack this. You can imagine some really perfect scenarios, like where you play this on turn 3 and it wipes out the opponent's early board. That's perfect. Scenarios exist, but I also think the average scenario for this card is going to feel a lot lower. Sometimes you're just going to play a 2/5 that doesn't feel good on turn 3 at all. Like, oh shoot, I wish I just had a card that had an effect or drew a card or did something, because this is just a 2/5 taunt. That's really boring in some matchups. And then other times your opponent's gonna have like 3/3s on board, and he's just gonna kind of suicide himself against 3/3s and not feel like he did anything at all. Like, he's just not relevant. Oh, he just died, he just killed himself off here for free, and I just kind of like softened up their minions. That's gonna feel really bad. Plus, I think any turn beyond turn 3, this is gonna feel especially bad. The Finale won't necessarily be any harder to activate, although it might, but it's just that his stats aren't going to scale very well. You know, he's going to be going up against 5/5s and stuff and feel absolutely terrible. So for me, you know, I don't think this is going to be a good enough answer against aggro boards often enough that he's worth the downsides in every other scenario. His peak might be really, really nice, but his average result, as far as I'm concerned, is going to feel pretty bad and pretty low. So I'm not quite as high on the Festival Security as many people. I wish cards like this were great in Hearthstone. I wish this was a great answer to aggro decks. I'm not actually convinced that it will be. Tony, King of Piracy, is a 4-star card. Merch Seller is a 2-star card. Outfit Tailor is a 4-star card. Posic Audio Engineer is a 3-star card. Audio Amplifier is a 3-star card. Frequency Oscillator is a 4-star card. Amplified Elic is a 2-star card. Stereo Totem is a 3-star card. Worgen Roadie is a 1-star card. Metronome is a 3-star card. Pyrotechnician is a 1-star card. Static Waveform is a 2-star card. Festival Security is a 2-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for this review. Let me know what you think about these cards. What are you going to do with Tony, King of Piracy? I'm curious to hear all those thoughts and more. I'll also drop a note. I'm traveling the next 4 days. I've got a top secret Hearthstone thing I'm doing, and reviews might be a little bit spotty. I think I've got everything planned ahead and good to go, but if something's a little late or missing a card here or there or whatever, forgive me, because I'll be on the road trying to organize all of that. So should be okay, but just keep that in mind. That said, thanks much as always for watching, and until next time, game on.